Welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Human School, where we talk a little bit about our processes and learning behind the scenes, what we're learning about in our spare time, and then some new conversations around the compass points. So let's start with our Inside the Human School question for this week. Our question is, how do you decide what to read, and where do you find ideas for those articles or books?
My answer is easy because it's Randy. I go to Randy, makes great suggestions, and then I read those. I think the only thing I'll add to the conversation before that is, I buy a lot of books on Amazon and through Kindle. And once you start to get in kind of a pattern, the algorithm does make pretty good, interesting recommendations. So that would be one place, like from a book-based perspective, I've gotten some great suggestions based on my prior reading.
Yeah, I think that people have described me as a book whore. Interestingly enough, yes, I have an unlimited budget for books.
As we all should.
I do not limit that part of my budget.
Good job.
Which is a little crazy. And Chad knows how many books I have because he's helped sort them out by genre so that I can figure out how to find books. So I think there's a couple ways that I figure out what to read. First, recommendations that I see online, and usually recommendations in adjacent spaces. For example, one of the people that we enjoy reading and learning from is Adam Grant. So every quarter, I believe, or every season, he posts to like 20 top nonfiction books. And they're usually the books that he's probably read prior to publication and has written some nice little blurbs about. So making connections to those books. In fact, I think I just ordered 4 of those in his latest one online, mostly pre-orders. So, you take the recommendations of experts. And then I think a second way in terms of books is that when you read those books, you find recommendations or things that are quoted from other books. For example, reading the Emergent Strategy book that I think Chad has referenced a number of times took me to the Complex Adaptive Leadership book, which I'm enjoying and which is resonating with a lot of our mind shifts and helping me revisit a lot of the ideas around leadership. So I think looking to experts, and then I think reading stuff and then sort of kind of going down the rabbit holes. And I'm sure Complex Adaptive Leadership, that book, I can't remember if that's the exact title, but that will lead me to some other new things along the way. People like Todd Rose, every time they come out with a book, we read that. And there are other authors too that will resonate with some of the things. Now, in terms of articles, God, I've been talking a lot here, and this is the last thing I'll say, but in terms of articles, I think it's subscribing to websites or mailing lists that people have. So, like Getting Smart, or even something non-education-y like Harvard Business Review will, there'll be an article from, remember we did Hubert Joly, that article, that was a Harvard Business Review article that resonated with the idea of magic and connecting with the human. So I think mailing lists are good for articles, and experts and other books are good for books.
So yeah, I'll go with Chad's answer that I learned from both of you. But no, I would agree with that. I think the algorithm, not just on Amazon, but even on like Instagram, some of the things that pop up, and then I'm going to now forget the other half of his name. Ryan
Holiday
reading list. He sends out a reading list each quarter, and especially this massive one at the end of each year that I have archived in a folder in my email with like everything ever. Now, it's not just about leadership. It's fiction, it's nonfiction, so on and so forth. But following some people like that for me on Instagram also leads me to some other places and other books as well. And then, like Randy said, signing up for newsletters, reading those articles, and then sort of playing the trail of where else they lead you is definitely part of that process too.
I mean, I think that the thing that Randy shared earlier is something that I have grown to really appreciate in the last couple of years, which is reading adjacent. And that's not to say that educationally focused literature books is bad. That's not, I don't want to infer that, but there's something that I have found much more compelling or interesting to take something that falls out the traditional paradigm of education and considering it inside the paradigm. And so, you'd read a book like Adam Grant's Think Again. You wouldn't think of that as an education book, but clearly it's about how every decision we make, if from classroom teacher to a building principal to a district leader, has to reconsider their perspectives. And so there is incredible application to the world of education if you're willing to do the mental work to consider it. And I would say, I'll say something maybe potentially critical, but I think that educators would benefit from doing a lot more adjacent reading than what they tend to do, which is very practitioner heavy. And there's nothing wrong with it. But it assumes a lot of things about teaching that doesn't feel resonant in the rest of the world. And I think that one of the challenges we have is that education is supposed to be preparing kids for a world, but yet it's incredibly insulated in its own paradigm, in its own world. And one way that we have to get outside of it is by reading adjacent literature or information or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, another suggestion for people that are listening is oftentimes we find we don't have enough time to read books or to really digest them. So if you find a book that you're interested or curious about, Google the title of that book plus book summary. And oftentimes you'll get it's the 80-20 rule. You'll get the 80% of the book in a summary, or go find podcasts of that author, of that thought leader, and you can get, again, the 80% of it, and then you can decide whether you actually want to read it or not. So that's something that I have found very useful to do, to actually consume lots of stuff.
And if I can add two other things then, if we're talking about how we read, I mean, number one is a scan. So I think that there is also this idea, like I oftentimes will do a first reading and it's really fast. It's scanned. Is there new information, things that I want to dig deeply into? Does it resonate and connect with me? And if it does, then I'll go back and do a more concrete, I don't have the right language for this, but a more deep reading of the book. And I might commit to reading one chapter every 2 days. And I read one chapter one day and I reflect and write or reflect and do some type of thinking exercise or do the things within it. And so instead of trying to read fast in that way, now I'm being slow and intentional with how I read.
So I know, Rachel, you're going to say something because I have one more thing to add to that. Sorry, I just have to share the story that in the courses that I teach in college, one of the things that I had showed them was how you could do an inspectional read of the texts, and again, approaching the goodness in people, assuming that it's all for the better. And that is that allowing them to not read something if it didn't resonate with them. You can, yes, I want you to read this chapter this week, but if it doesn't resonate with you, just do an inspectional read of it and be prepared to talk about the ideas. Or if it really resonates with you and you want to dig into it, go slow, read it twice, whatever, you can do that. So let's push back on that assumption that we learned in our K-12 days that the teacher will tell us what we need to read and how quickly we need to read it and whether it should be relevant to us or not. Like, you don't need to read stuff that isn't making any sense to you. Because maybe it's not the time to read that. Maybe you're going to read it 5 years from now and it'll make total sense to you. Have you ever had that? Like, you tried to read a book and you're like, God, no, I can't do that. And then you came back to it after you had evolved your thinking and you're like, damn, now I get it. So inspectional read, that's a great tool. We should write about that.
So we'll move on to what are we curious about this week? What are some of the things that you've learned or you've been thinking about?
For me, I'll try to be not so emotional about this, but I work with people and we do a lot of goal setting, and this innate desire and need for people to fall back into quantifiable data or numbers when goal setting. And this idea that, if only 30% of our learners do this, or 25% of our learners do this, or there's all this discussion if, is it achievement versus growth? And, and if 25% of our kids grow, and then at the end of that conversation, who wants to collect that data? Who's going to analyze that data? How is it going to be used? And, nobody wants to do that. And so I think about our compass points and our mind shift, our compass point, around curation and around the mind shift of valuing stories as much as numbers, that we live in a world of stories, that there are stories that we should actively seek to tell based on those goals, right? But yet we always fall back into the safety net of wanting a number to justify or quantify that thing. And it's the same conversation we have about grades. What is the value of a grade when it's just this thing that exists in a grade book? And what's the story that the student or the learner could tell about their growth? But we don't trust the learner. We don't trust our own knowledge or our own wisdom about that learner. And so we've got to put it into a number. And it's this obsession that people have, even when they know that the story is the way, they still want the safety net of the number that they can quantify and share. So I don't know that it's new learning. It's just how entrenched numbers are in the work.
I think for me, there's a connection to I think what you said, Chad. And for me, like I know as we develop the compass points and the mind shift, I'm like, yeah, I'm a curious person. Yeah, I'm good. But there's always more. That's the beauty of these things. It's like it's a bottomless pit. You can always learn and grow more if you keep being curious. So I think I've tried in the recent past to hone my curiosity and more like in line with questioning, and because I think sometimes questioning can come off as being arrogant or threatening or like, who do you think you are kind of stuff, get that kind of response. So how do you be a conversationalist who's curious without putting people on edge? And so I've had fun sort of tinkering with that and practicing, just trying to be curious and wondering, and basically creating the conditions for people to share their thinking so that I can become better at creating those conditions, but also can learn better from some new thinking. So that's sort of my mind shift and compass point that I've been toying around with.
Just real quickly to affirm that, somebody one time told me, when you ask the question, help me to understand, that they didn't love that felt condescending. And I thought that was interesting. I had not thought about it from the receiver of that question. So to your point, having to try out different forms of questions, that the intention of the question doesn't always land. It's less about our intention and more about how it's received. And so to your point, like that's something I continue to play with, is how do I ask a better question, but also how do I ask a better question better?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm in another book club with some friends, and we're reading a book called Stay and Fight, and it's fiction.
Whoa. You're in another book club that doesn't involve us? That's new information.
I am. I have other friends besides the two of you. It's shocking. I know.
Wow.
I'm sorry.
Why are you apologizing?
I don't know. I felt like I was supposed to. So it's fiction, but it takes place. I wrote about it in the inquiry inventory this week, but I keep thinking about it as I'm reading it. It takes place in Appalachia in Ohio, and it's this very poor family. They have a little boy, and then two women, and then a third woman who's not in their relationship but lives in their space. And they do a lot of teaching around the woods and farming and harvesting and hunting and things like that. And that as their son gets old enough and he goes off to school, his set of learning and knowledge is not valued. And there's a series of instances that happen, but there's a lot of really interesting conversations around education and learning and the purpose of school and, who decides what learning is valuable. And it's something that I just think about a lot. I think about my grandfather, and he was incredibly smart. And sure, he knew a lot of stuff, but I think the thing that made me feel like he was really smart is that he knew how to do a lot. And if he didn't know how to do it, he would figure it out. And I think often when I look at schools, I look at high schools, how I don't know that he would fit and be considered smart or great in our current school system. I think, he understood a lot, he read a lot, but I think his interests were pretty narrow and were really active. They were not about content, and they were not about quantity. They were about action and doing. And so I'm thinking a lot about that narrowing of education into knowledge and content and quantity, as opposed to the action piece, and how there's even seemingly a value and intelligence level placed on people who have one set of knowledge and not the other. But in reality, not really sure how that sets. So that's the thing that I kind of keep thinking about this week. And then building off of that, we also wanted to start talking about something that we've learned about our compass points, either a new learning or something that we've seen as we were going about our days. So what are we thinking?
Oh, I'll just repeat what I repeated before. I'm sorry. I thought that was the question we were answering.
Me too.
I'm sorry. You told
That's
me
okay.
it was in addition to.
We've changed it up.
That's fine. Go ahead.
That's okay. So I have nothing else to add at the moment. We'll save it for the next Inside the Human School.
Okay. Deal.
How's that?
I'll edit. I'll cut that.
Fine.
Leave it in. Nobody watches it anyway.
Oh, goodness. All right. Well, wanted to thank you for learning alongside us this week in Inside the Human School. If you would like to learn more, please visit our learning hub at thehuman.school or join us in our Facebook community. And we, as always, would love to hear more about how you're working to place humanity at the center of all design. Bye.
Appreciate you guys. You help me deepen my thinking.